Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this morning's session on trans rights globally, the progress and decline in a polarized world. I'll be the moderator of the session. My name is Rikki Nathanson. I am the Senior Advisor of the Global Trans Program here at Outright Action International. And joining me are my fellow panelists who I will ask to introduce themselves. Tina, Orban, Alexa Hoffman, who is about to join us, Erika Castellanos, and Andre Rivera. So I'll start with Erika. Do you want to go first?
Sure. Thank you, Rikki. And thank you for Outright to invite me to join you in this panel. And congratulations on the Outright Summit. My name is Erika Castellanos. I'm Director of Programs at GATE, Global Action for Trans Equality.
Thank you. And we'll move on to Andre.
Muchas gracias, gracias por la invitación. Realmente es para mí un enorme placer poder estar aquí como panelista. Bueno, mi nombre es Andre Rivas, soy presidenta de Familias Diversas, es una asociación civil que tiene base en Argentina, una asociación que lucha por la igualdad de las personas LGBTIQ+. Yo soy una activista lésbica no binaria de Argentina, también soy co-chair de la sociedad civil en la Equal Rights Coalition y también estoy como becaria del programa de Naciones Unidas que tiene Outright International. Así que muchas gracias por invitarme.
Thank you. And we now have Tina.
Thank you, Rikki, and I would like to express my gratitude for being in this panel with Erika and Andrea, which is led by Rikki and Alexa. It's really a pleasure for me to be here. I'm calling in from Hungary, and I'm representing Transfamilial Transgender Association, which I am vice president of.
Thank you very much. I can't see if Alexa has joined us yet. Is she on the call? She may be having some difficulties. So we will be discussing today the global landscape of what's happening in the world around trans rights, both the gains and the losses, the implications that are associated with those gains and those losses. And we'll be sort of looking and we'll be discussing how best we can forge a way forward and how we can make, what plans we can make to ensure that these rights that we are achieving are gained by everybody. While we wait for Alexa, I think I'll move on to Erika to set the landscape. And Erika, if you can tell us what's been going on globally, if you can just speak to us about, if you can set the pace and let us know what progress has been made in the trans movement, what's facilitating this progress, and what barriers this movement is encountering. Over to you, Erika.
Thank you very much, Rikki. So, you know, when we talk about progress and we talk about the trans movement, it's sometimes very difficult to talk about it in a blanket statement. Because while we can't deny that in average, there has been much progress made in the past few years, when we talk about the trans movement around the world, unfortunately, this progress is not homogeneous worldwide. While some countries have taken steps forward in ensuring the safety, guaranteeing the rights of trans people, other countries have taken massive leaps backwards. Even within a country, the progress or retrocession cannot be generalized. In the same country, there might be advances in one area, for example, in access to education, while completely denying our right to access to healthcare. There are a couple of examples I would like to highlight to demonstrate the contrast between progress and regression in the current state of trans movements. So the first one is about reach. The word trans and trans people is generally not a far off, foreign, abstract thing that we know nothing about except for that regular movie or the stand-up comedian that uses us to make jokes. Some people hate us, but at least they finally are starting to know what and who it is they are talking about. trans is a word that is more common in everyday life. We definitely need to use that and look at it as an advantage. The second one is existence. Although there still remain a few, there are the exception. Now, most countries around the world recognize our existence, be that because they really care or because recognizing us will attract more international funding for their programs, which, by the way, we rarely benefit from. Whatever the reason, we are often mentioned in policy documents, in national strategies, and in speeches from politicians. If anything, it has validated to many that what we already knew. We exist, and with that acknowledgement of existence comes the erasure of invisibility and an opportunity, a huge opportunity, one that we should not take lightly and we should take full advantage of. Another area is around laws and policies. Several countries have advanced in legal gender recognition, social protection, access to education, labor, etc. for trans people. But unfortunately, some have done completely the opposite, passing laws and policies that further violate our human rights and continue oppressing us. And there are all shades of examples, which I will refrain to classify as there is no need to make a martyr competition out of suffering. Our collective struggles. So we have gender identity laws that are based on self-determination in different countries, Argentina, Denmark, Chile, Malta, just to name a few. A huge gain that we should be proud of is the depathologization in ICD-11, which, by the way, will start being implemented in January 2022. So we have an amazing year ahead and a great work to do and hold our governments accountable. Another is states acknowledging, apologizing, and offering reparations to victims of sterilization as requirement included under their past gender identity laws. This is an example in Sweden and the Netherlands. Initiatives have emphasized on improving the socioeconomic conditions faced by trans people, example in Argentina, with laws that are being passed there. But the trans movements have never been an easy position. There are key factors facilitating progress. There's more available funding for trans-led networks, organizations, and activists. And this is in comparison to years ago. More trans participation in decision-making processes, not necessarily because we were invited, but because we take ownership of the spaces and we demand. More acknowledgement of trans issues as complex and of trans expertise as really necessary to address them. And also there's more reliable data on trans people and the issues that affect us. There is more community-driven data and community-generated data also that we need to learn to put a greater value on. But there's also multiple barriers. While I mentioned access to funding as a facilitator, it's also a huge barrier because the funding that is available is far from enough to support an independent and strong trans movement. Trans participation in decision-making process is far from ideal. We need to celebrate that, yes, there's more participation, but it is not enough, both numerically and in terms of decision of power. The issues of power inequalities in decision-making spaces is still a problem. There's still a huge lack of data about trans people and the issues affecting us, particularly on socioeconomic issues. There's a powerful, strong, and we can never underestimate it, global anti-trans movement, a wave that is fueled by anti-gender movements. And what do these movements do? They are against gender identity laws based on self-determination. They are promoting fear by affirming that trans people's human rights are dangerous for cisgender women. They are repathologizing trans people by considering that there is a trans epidemic that is being produced by gender ideology or gender theory, which is affecting children and teenagers. So it's appealing to fear. And they're advocating against human rights protection for trans people. For example, by promoting discrimination in the access to key services, key issues that many people take for granted, like accessing a public restroom, and by campaigning to make legal conversion therapies against trans people possible in the countries. So as we can see, we have advanced, but it hasn't been an homogeneous advance and progress around the world. We advance, we take retrocession in other areas. And that's how the current trans movement is. It's very different. It's not homogeneous. It looks very different from country to country, from region to region, and within countries. There's a lot of work to be done, but I really just want to celebrate our trans peers around the world for their courage, who have been able to fight to take us where we are today. Thank you, Rikki.
Thank you, Erika. And I do believe that Alexa has joined us. She has been having some technical difficulties, and she will be joining us, but unfortunately without her camera. Alexa, are you on?
Yes, sorry about that. Here on a new device, just had to set a couple of permissions so the microphone can hear me. Yes, fine. I hope that everyone is having a good day today. I was listening very attentively to what Erika was saying. For those of you who are not familiar with me, my name is Alexa Hoffman. I am the Caribbean Program Associate with Outright Action International. And I'm also on the ground locally in Barbados, a transgender human rights defender. So anything to do with the trans community or human rights in general, I usually, put myself forward to say, at least say something, even if I can't, get my hands in the machinery to do something. And listening carefully to what Erika was saying about the insurgence of anti-trans ideologies in various societies, even in societies where it seemed like people already had some type of an understanding about who trans people are, who we are, and what our lives may be like. We're seeing this sudden influx of ideology that's either trying to portray us as somehow mentally unstable, or as it being somehow in poor health simply because of who we are and not because of what barriers we may face, and even going as far as to deem us as threats to society, to the global population in general. And unfortunately, we're also having cases of people not doing their own due diligence, not taking the time to get to know trans people, not taking the time to, even look up certain claims when they're made to know what is a true claim and what is absolute rubbish. Because that is going on, anti-trans ideology, I'm finding, is becoming very pervasive in our societies. And we need to it's causing us to be in a position where we have to go right back to the very beginning, where we have to explain who we are, what to expect, what not to expect from us. But at least by taking the time to do that, we're also making ourselves visible. And we need to address the various barriers that come along with our visibility. Not that us being visible is a bad thing, but we still have lives that have to go on. We still have our families to look after, our loved ones to take care of. We still have our obligations day to day from Monday to Monday. And, we also have to deal with the challenges that we face in our visibility. Things like employment discrimination, housing discrimination, inability to properly access healthcare, even things like the unfortunate, what happens to us when we've met our end. In my experience observing members of the trans community who've passed on, usually there's hardly a word said about it outside of the communities. Or should I say, for lack of better words, sometimes we get lost. And when I say we get lost, it's not that someone has misplaced our remains, but we're treated in a manner that does not always dignify who we are as trans people, whether it is relatives insisting on burying us or cremating us in a certain fashion, or even preventing our loved ones from being able to come and say their final farewells. These are some of the things that came to mind when I heard Erika speak. Now, just to bring us back around to the topic at hand, being any progresses or declines in trans rights advocacy. While I said earlier, we do have a greater understanding, or rather we have had a greater understanding now in 2021 compared to, in the late 60s and early 70s at the advent of LGBTQ advocacy following the Stonewall riots. We still have a long ways to go. As Erika said, we still have issues where employee protections don't always include transgender people. We even have situations, for example, the recently passed Charter of Barbados, as we became a republic last Tuesday, even though it mentioned, that everyone is born free and equal in human rights and dignity, regardless of age, race, sex, gender, sexual orientation, it doesn't mention gender identity. And while those of us who may be more experienced in human rights advocacy would know how trans people can get our foot in the door, in my opinion, it is a lot better settled when you flat out say gender identity and expression alongside of sexual orientation. Because otherwise, to the average person looking at the documents, looking at the words, they're not going to realize that gender identity and expression are also included. And so it leaves this sense of exclusion on trans people. I am not sure what more I can say on the issue, because this is, I always find it to be such a complex discussion, a complex topic, because especially on the global front, because how things may appear in the Caribbean, for example, in the Spanish-speaking parts of the Caribbean, like the Dominican Republic and Cuba. It's not always clear. Sorry, wrong choice of words. It's not always the same. So what we may do here in Barbados may be a different approach in the Dominican Republic. And I've witnessed that for myself. Back in 2016, I believe it was. I believe Erika was there with me when we attended the 46th General Assembly of the OAS. And I recall, my colleagues in the English-speaking Caribbean, when we noticed, for example, there was a point where protests started to pop up impromptu. One fine example was the audience with the Secretary General at the time. I'm not sure if it's the same person there now, but this was literally the evening right after the Pulse nightclub shootings. And the English-speaking contingent for the Caribbean LGBTQ community, we had decided, we're going to write a statement condemning the attacks, ask the Secretary General, since OAS deals with human rights, what are they going to do? Meanwhile, in that same building that we were in, there was an issue where somebody was carding transgender women who wanted to access the ladies' restroom. And where in the English-speaking Caribbean, we have an incident like that, we come together, we discuss it, and we figure, okay, how are we going to approach this? In the case of the Latin American contingent for trans people, particularly members of Red Lac Trans, who I represent for the Barbadian part of it, they actually got together. I don't know where they came up with it. I don't know where they got it from, but they got some sort of a sheet. I don't know if it was a bed sheet or what, but they got this sheet and wrote on it. I can't remember what was written on it. It was in black and white and in Spanish. And they're at the Secretary General is at the head of the hall, and the trans group is at the back, and they're mounting their protests from there. So again, tying back in with some things that Erika said, when it comes to context and advocacy, it can change from location to location. And wherever we are, there doesn't seem to be a right or wrong way to do advocacy insofar as we're making sure that our human rights are being observed and protected. So I think I'll end on that point and hand back over to you, Rikki.
Thank you so much, Alexa. I mean, such great points that we have to discuss, but we don't have much time, so I want to move on to Tina, who I'm going to ask there have been major setbacks in fundamental rights of LGBT persons in Hungary, and in particular the trans population. Can you highlight these issues for us? And what do you think needs to happen to change those?
Thank you very much, Rikki. And I do have a presentation which will come up hopefully rather soon. So I will talk about, that's not the presentation, but this one is. Thank you. So I will talk about trans rights in Hungary, but it's important to know that it's not just happening in Hungary, it's happening all around the place, what I will talk about. And first, some nice stuff before we enter into the sad story. So Trans Vanilla, which I'm representing, is an NGO advocating for trans inclusion in Hungary. And we try and empower our community to fight for our rights. We support trans people and their families. We try to provide a sustainable resource for our community and allies. We are advocating for social, legal, and medical change, and we are raising awareness of issues trans people face in Hungary. So I think we are a great organization, so I wanted to use this 1 minute to advertise us a bit, and then we can dive into the facts and the story that has happened in Hungary with the help of the next slide, where I had really just put the facts. So life was not perfect and beautiful before May 2020, but that was the date when I believe that Hungary became famous of being anti-trans. That was the month when basically the government has banned legal gender recognition, with passing a law which states that the sex and gender registered at birth is immutable. We don't have separate words in Hungarian for sex and gender, so sometimes it's quite difficult to explain things. The government believes that only sex exists. So I will use that often because I use that language. With this, legal gender recognition is basically banned in the country, and no one can even change their first names because we have gendered first names in the country. So if someone is registered a male, they cannot have a female name. It's that easy. We thought that it's the end of the world, but in December 2020, the government have introduced changes to the fundamental law of Hungary, which is basically the constitution. They had put into interesting things like the father is a man and the mother is a woman. Somehow the grass is green and the sky is blue is not there yet, but we are advocating for that. They have also put into the fundamental law that the state protects children's rights to identify with their sex at birth. And then we have to wait another 6 months before the parliament was discussing an anti-pedophilia act. And somehow last minute, the government have introduced interesting changes, and they have prohibited products, advertisements, and media content available to minors, which represents an identity not corresponding to the sex at birth, gender reassignment, or homosexuality. They have banned educational programs covering these issues, and also social advertisements cannot cover such topics. And it was not the end of the story yet, because in July, the government have, so just to put it into a little bit more context, there was no possibility for referendums in the country. The government has introduced in the morning that referendums can happen. 2 hours later, the prime minister have announced that the government is launching a referendum with 5 questions. Out of 5, 3 are trans-related. Questions like, do you support sex reassignment procedures being promoted to minors? Do you support sex reassignment procedures being available for minors? Do you support that media programs which portray sex change shall be available for minors? One of the questions, which is the access to treatment for minors, is outlawed by the Supreme Court. The others will be voted on next April with the upcoming general elections of the country. They have just modified the law on elections and referendums this month or last month. So referendum and election can happen on the same day. It was not possible before. So this way they kind of will have a valid referendum. And if we go to the next slide, then I will explain why these facts and actions are really not important without being put into context. Because what we can see, we can go to the next slide. So what we can see in Hungary is that it started with migrants. This government started to have an anti-migrant campaign. Can we go back, please? And then after that topic kind of is not bringing voters and they cannot really fight migrants anymore, then they became really anti-gender, banning gender studies in the country and not and outlawing a Council of Europe Convention on violence against women because it contains the word on gender. They are vetoing everything in the European Union if gender is mentioned in the document. The government is absolutely anti-democratic. Rule of law is not respected by them. Each and every action they did against trans people in the country also is not respectful of the rule of law, starting with we never were consulted. And I could list for hours what is not okay, what they do. The level of corruption is absolutely high in the country. And I believe that we who fight for human rights, democracy, and those who fight against corruption, we have to unite and we have to do a lot of things together. And I think that was, we can go to the last slide where you can see how you can reach and follow TransVanilla. And I'm looking forward to the discussion that we will have. And thank you.
Thank you very much, Tina. So much work lies ahead of us. But we'll swing over to Andre Rivas now, where Argentina, where you come from, there's been major wins, and Argentina has been lauded as being one of the most progressive countries when it comes to trans rights. But you'll tell us a bit about that and also paint a different picture by tying into that the impact of the trans labor quota and what we need to be aware to guarantee that our advances do not suffer. So I'll hand it over to you, Andre.
Bueno, muchas gracias. La verdad que cada una de las intervenciones es sumamente brillante y da para realmente hacer un summit especial sobre estos derechos que estamos hablando. Bueno, como ustedes saben, en Argentina, en el peor momento de la pandemia, con la organización del movimiento, de todo el movimiento, atrás de un pedido histórico de la comunidad travesti trans de Argentina, se tomó el momento en que las personas no podían salir a trabajar, en las cuales la movilidad estaba totalmente reducida y el impacto en las personas travesti trans y no binarias era el mayor. Allí todo el movimiento se organizó para un reclamo que, como digo, ya era histórico de la comunidad, se pusiera en agenda. En agenda porque las compañeras travesti trans se morían de hambre, literalmente. Y esto es algo que el concepto del travesticidio social, de que las personas trans, aparte de la violencia por crímenes de prejuicio que puedan llegar a sufrir, sufren lo que es una eliminación sistemática por la exclusión social. Entonces, esa fue la organización que hicimos para poner en agenda. Por suerte, y digo con mucho trabajo del movimiento, logramos que el gobierno nacional actual sacara un decreto por el cual implementaba el cupo laboral travesti trans. ¿Qué significa esto? Que el Poder Ejecutivo, mediante ese decreto, tenía la obligación de que el 1% de la totalidad de la planta de todos sus empleados tenían que ser personas travesti trans. Y no tenían que tener ningún tipo de limitación si habían estudiado o no, y todas las demás barreras que se ponen. Todo lo contrario. Esto iba a tener que ser un esfuerzo que tenía que hacer el Estado para que después las personas travestis trans y no binarias pudiesen acceder a una carrera dentro del Estado en condiciones de igualdad que otros de sus compañeros. Ahora bien, A nosotros en ese momento nos parecía que un decreto, por supuesto que esto fue totalmente bienvenido y fue un gran logro, pero necesitábamos una ley. Somos conscientes de que hay instrumentos jurídicos que son altamente bienvenidos porque son los primeros pasos en los avances legales. La legalidad formal evidentemente es un piso, es un primer paso. Pero luego tenemos que buscar una legalidad formal aún más fuerte para que permanezca en el tiempo. Así que fue allí cuando seguimos trabajando para que se pudiese sancionar una ley del cupo laboral travesti y trans. Y se sancionó. Y esto ya se está aplicando y se está implementando. Y hay todo un programa dentro del Estado que hace posible que se pueda implementar. Ahora bien, para llegar aquí, fue muy importante que cuando se creó en el 2019 el Ministerio de Mujeres, Géneros y Diversidad, primero se creara un ministerio, se jerarquizara los temas de las mujeres y las personas de la diversidad con el nivel jerárquico que tiene un ministerio, y que se incluyeran dentro de este mismo ministerio. Porque antes a veces no se sabía bien dónde teníamos que estar y algunas políticas, por ejemplo, destinadas a las mujeres cis, no eran aplicadas para las personas LGBTQA+, o para las personas trans. Bueno, a partir de la creación de este ministerio no cabe duda. No cabe duda porque aparte hay una secretaría específica de Estado que trabaja las políticas de igualdad y diversidad y que aparte tiene en su cabeza, la dirige y fue nombrada la primera mujer trans secretaria de Estado. Y esto habla de lo que es una política de Estado también. No hubiésemos podido llegar a todo esto si no hay diversos actores que estamos trabajando hacia el mismo objetivo. Y en este sentido, la construcción, no solo como sujeto de derecho de las personas travesti, trans y no binarias, nos cuesta un montón, sino que también como sujeto político, ¿no es cierto?, de participación en la política y en la toma de las decisiones de Estado. Y esto realmente es sumamente importante porque no solo está realmente yendo con una acción positiva del Estado a desarmar una desigualdad y discriminación estructural hacia las personas travesti, trans y no binarias, como es la de que, bueno, con una acción positiva del Estado puedan acceder al empleo, sino que también tiene otro, en mi opinión, impacto muy importante, que todas las personas travesti, trans y no binarias que ahora están accediendo al Estado, a los tres poderes del Estado, porque esto abarca con la ley no solo al poder ejecutivo, sino también al poder legislativo y al poder judicial, van a transformar el Estado. Digamos, necesitamos que las personas travesti, trans y no binarias estén en el Estado para que el Estado también tome una perspectiva transfeminista, más allá de las gestiones o las administraciones que estén. Y en este sentido, yo quiero rescatar un poco lo que acaba de decir Tina. Es muy importante también que, si bien estos logros son sumamente, yo diría, históricos, lo que estaba sucediendo en Argentina, los tenemos que cuidar, porque a veces pensamos que, bueno, ya está, ganamos la cuota laboral, travesti trans, ahora tenemos este ministerio y esto es genial, y tenemos una subsecretaria trans, y hay, digamos, un montón de políticas que están combatiendo y erradicando la violencia para personas LGBTQA+, también, con todas sus identidades, pero hay algunas de estas cuestiones que son posibles porque digamos, hay una administración de Estado que es favorable a las luchas de nuestro movimiento. Pero, como ustedes saben, en Latinoamérica y también en Argentina, esto no es así. Y si ustedes ven las últimas elecciones de Argentina, por ejemplo, el voto conservador, ultraconservador, ganó muchísimo espacio. Y, por ejemplo, una persona que aquí se llaman los libertarios, que hasta están planteando una superioridad estética. Miren lo que les digo, están planteando eso, vienen a plantear una superioridad estética. En el caso de la Ciudad Autónoma de Buenos Aires, que es la ciudad más rica de la Argentina, salió en estas últimas elecciones de medio término, o sea, legislativas, como la tercera fuerza, acá localmente. Y estas nuevas fuerzas que se van uniendo, que son como pequeños partidos, porque no pueden llegar a un gran partido, pero son pequeños que van sumando y después se van aliando en el Congreso, son de ultraderecha y tienen todo este tema del movimiento antigénero que está absolutamente en todas partes. Y como dijo Tina, es importante que también interseccionalicemos las agendas con otros aliados, como por ejemplo les aliados de la agenda anticorrupción y de transparencia. ¿Por qué? Porque nos van a ayudar a justamente generar mecanismos de participación ciudadana donde estemos nosotros y no otros representándonos, para que podamos garantizar que más allá de quién esté hoy al frente del Estado argentino, esa ley se implemente y que las personas que entran puedan entrar y progresar y se les esté dando un trato digno, como dijo Alexa, porque acá la ley de Argentina garantiza el trato digno y es pionera, pero uno de los problemas que tenemos después es el de los accesos a los derechos, sobre todo en áreas rurales, en áreas donde a veces, por ejemplo, el norte de Argentina todavía tiene una gran idiosincrasia de mucho conservadurismo, donde también penetra mucho todo el movimiento antigénero, y allí las personas trans, travesti trans o no binarias tienen que migrar, hay una migración muy grande interna para otras ciudades, y ahí la policía, las fuerzas de seguridad, el poder judicial, que todavía no, porque vamos a pedir una reforma transfeminista del poder judicial, porque si no tenemos una justicia que tenga una perspectiva transfeminista, no vamos a poder tener justicia para las personas travesti, trans o no binarias o de nuestro movimiento, porque a pesar de que pasamos todos los test de legalidad y a pesar de todos estos avances, tenemos una gran red de personas antigénero en lugares de un poder alto y concentrado. En Argentina es así el poder. Y ese poder económico y también de lugares de privilegio, como por ejemplo en el poder judicial, está en manos de poderes de personas antigénero. Y aparte, también hay instituciones que si bien han avanzado bastante, todavía no están trabajando lo necesario, en mi opinión, como por ejemplo la escuela. Hoy todavía cuesta muchísimo que se respeten las identidades trans y no binarias de niñes, de nuestros niñes. Todavía se pide tiempo, como si fuese una cuestión de tiempo y no de cumplir un derecho humano, aunque aún aquí en Argentina teniendo una ley y leyes de tanta avanzada, ¿no? Entonces, por eso es muy importante seguir trabajando en todos estos mecanismos que nos garanticen que estos derechos llegaron acá para quedarse y para aún todavía tener más avance y para que podamos mejorar el acceso a ellos. Y en este sentido, quiero cerrar con eso, con que la corrupción es un factor que es favorable al movimiento antigénero. Entonces tenemos que trabajar también con estos nuevos aliados, porque lo que viven las compañeras travesti trans con las fuerzas de seguridad y la impunidad que le puede dar el Poder Judicial hoy a determinadas causas, no la podemos dejar pasar. Necesitamos seguir ahora avanzando hacia estos lugares para que estas leyes que ganamos permanezcan. Y otra cosita más que anteriormente Erika dijo, también el Estado tiene que reparar. Ahora es la hora que el Estado tiene que reparar. tiene que reparar a todas aquellas personas que no tuvieron estas oportunidades y que han perdido oportunidades y que han tenido malas condiciones de vida por una vulneración sistemática a sus derechos humanos por parte del Estado. Así que esto también es lo próximo que vamos a estar luchando. Bueno, muchas gracias. Espero haberme mantenido en el tiempo.
You were fine. Thank you so much. Thank you, Andre. So I'd just like to open it up to if we can have a frank discussion among ourselves. I mean, a lot has come up in these discussions between Erika, Tina, Alexa, and you, Andre. A lot of good things, but a lot of bad things. So I think picking up on what you said from the advances that you've had in Argentina, and Erika also alluded to the gains that we've had, for example, with the ICD, and the many gains we have made, pardon me, strides we made globally. Before we move to the anti, what would you say are the best practices that activists and advocates and organizations and people fighting for not only trans rights, but for rights in general around the world, what would you recommend are the best practices to be used when faced with any dilemma? And it's open to any of the panelists.
I can kick off the discussion here. So I think if I hesitate to use the word best practice, because, you know, it's like what works for a different country or region might not be the same. But I think what we can say is what generalized recommendation, what works well, what helps us advance and keeps the momentum going forward and prevent, and in some cases, it acts like harm reduction. Prevent it from going backwards, it's already a win. So there are a couple of things I would say. One is the regeneration of data, particularly community-led data. And after generating the data, using the data to implement evidence-based programs. So making sure that we're responding to the community needs and not just responding to well-intentioned ideas. Secondly, take ownership of decision-making platforms at the UN spaces and in regional political spaces, in your political systems in your own country. Don't wait to be invited. You know, we should just take ownership. I'm here, I'm present, I'm gonna talk. Thirdly, you know, when we're talking always about, oh, we need to give opportunity and give a seat of the table, that's bullshit. A seat of the table is no longer enough. We need and deserve leadership positions. If it's gonna be the word trans and it's gonna talk or be trans work, it needs to be a trans person in leadership position. And by the way, congratulations, Rikki, on your appointment, and congratulations to Outright for having you.
Thank you.
So that's a good example of trans people in leadership positions who are working around trans issues. Fourthly, you know, we cannot allow trans lives and trans bodies to be regulated or legislated by cisgender people. Even if they have the best of intentions, I'm sorry, you don't do that. And we need to be very clear. This is the line of the sand. You have no place regulating my body and my life. You are not a trans person. That's non-negotiable. Importantly, I think what we need to improve a lot as a trans movement is to learn to network and collaborate more. We need to stop competing with each other. I know that historically we have been so oppressed around us that it feels like, oh, we need to be always in fighting mode and survival mode, but we need to start uniting and collaborating with each other, but also including non-traditional partners with other movements and start gaining momentum with those partnerships. And lastly, I think we need to diversify our work, including our funding pools. We need to look at, you know, trans people don't exist in a bubble where only gender identity issues affect us. Everything else affects us. Climate change affects us. Housing affects us. Access to water affects us. Food, nutrition, everything affects us. If we look at the SDGs, effing SDGs that we can see there, we need to work on them and we need to be involved in all of them. So that's, I think, are my recommendations. We need to be involved in all aspects of our lives, diversify, and make sure our voices are not only heard, but they are recorded. And you know, that we push and hold accountable those people who make decisions.
Thank you, Erika. Andre, do you have anything to contribute? I mean, can you speak to how practically how were the gains achieved in Argentina? And was it a long, drawn-out process? I mean, you know, what was the strategic actions that were taken to get to where you got to?
Sí, totalmente. La estrategia es fundamental y también la unificación del movimiento y la organización del movimiento con un objetivo. Entonces es muy estratégico en ese sentido y se luchó mucho. Primero se generaron los consensos internos dentro del movimiento, esto fue fundamental. Hubo una parte de debates internos, ¿sí? Antes de, digamos, de poder empezar a ponerlo en agenda, o sea, qué se iba a poner en agenda, cómo se iba a poner en agenda, qué era posible obtener ahora, qué era posible pedir luego, ¿no es cierto? Todas estas cuestiones estratégicas en torno a cuando vamos a pedir una ley, lo mismo el momento de hacerlo, ¿cierto? Como fue en el momento de la pandemia, donde obviamente, ¿qué pasaba acá? El gobierno estaba estallado de planes sociales, entonces era el momento también de decir, bueno, vos esto lo podés corregir fácilmente con una acción positiva. Fíjate, cómo le cambiarías la vida a todas estas personas digamos, y aparte empezar a lo que dice también, bueno, adhiero absolutamente a todo lo que dijo Erika, totalmente de acuerdo, el tema de sujetos de derecho también. No por nada se llega a que también las personas trans estén como sujetos de derecho y políticos en Argentina. Y esto no es una construcción que se hizo de un día para el otro. Digamos, desde el año 90 se viene trabajando y se vienen ganando los espacios, se vienen disputando los espacios. Entonces, también toda esa historia es importante siempre tenerla presente. Digo, es algo que la verdad, yo por lo menos desde recuerdo, yo mi activismo lo comencé cuando todavía no estaba ninguna de las leyes, y era muy difícil estar en el Senado explicándole a los asesores que cuando había un travesticidio no era lo mismo, porque todavía ni siquiera teníamos el agravante por identidad de género o por orientación sexual. Entonces, todo esa lucha fue también ir poniendo, bueno, ¿por qué ley vamos a ir ahora? Porque ahora es esta ley, luego la otra. Entonces, indudablemente son estrategias que tienen que ver con ordenarse internamente, buscar consensos y aliades en los movimientos sociales, obviamente en la política, con legisladores, con quienes realmente pueden poner en agenda. Y esto fue fundamental. Fíjense que si ustedes ven la historia de los progresos legislativos en Argentina, van a concordar con determinados gobiernos, que son gobiernos que tienen gente dentro de las bancas legislativas o incluso en el poder ejecutivo, como sucede ahora y como sucedió cuando se sancionó la ley de identidad de género en Argentina, que tienen en su agenda expresamente que van a hacer avances legislativos. Pero reitero que es muy importante el consenso en el movimiento, la organización del movimiento, y ahora, más allá de lo que ha sucedido en Argentina, que es sumamente valioso y que seguimos trabajando para seguir avanzando, como dije, en nuevas leyes y en nuevas transformaciones, nunca parar, pienso sí es que realmente tenemos que buscar nuevos aliados y organizarnos globalmente. Porque tenemos que tomar, creo que todavía, en Argentina, como estamos disfrutando tanto de lo que hemos logrado, pienso que es fundamental también ver los riesgos que la organización del movimiento antigénero nos está dando, y no caer en un espacio ciego de que eso no nos puede llegar a pasar, y organizarnos globalmente con todo el movimiento LGBTIQ+. Fundamentalmente eso, ¿no? Para también que se puedan capitalizar estas experiencias en otro lado, y porque las personas antigénero ya están organizadas. Necesitamos dejar, en este caso, de ser reactivos y pasar a tener una estrategia que incluso supere la que están teniendo actualmente las personas que están en contra de nuestros derechos humanos.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you, Andre. So I don't see any questions in the chat box. Do we have questions on another platform in Feedloop? The Q&A?
Rikki, can I also add to this?
Yes. Sorry, Tina.
Thank you.
I just need to... Okay, that's great. So now
I will try to be...
No. Okay, I just wanted to keep some time to the audience, but no one has asked any questions, so we have another 9 minutes, and we can continue our discussion.
Okay, so I agree with everything what was said. That's no surprise. I have two things that I would like to talk about in addition. One is allyship and ownership, and the other one is visibility. I think it's really important that we unite globally as a trans movement, and we get more organized against the anti-gender movement. I think we are pretty much organized, but organizing against the anti-gender movement, I think we need to get stronger on that, and we need to reach out cross movement to actors who can support us, because we just cannot win the fight ourselves. We are just not strong enough, and we need allies, and there are allies out there. And in Europe and in Hungary, the trans movement is quite young, and we just had no places where we have been to. But I think when there are times when we are the scapegoats and we are attacked, everyone should back us, and we should lead the way when it comes around trans issues. So we have to live up to that, and we need to build those alliances. We cannot escape that task. And the other thing is the visibility that we get with the anti-gender movement. When we are under attack, for example, in Hungary, this visibility created by the hate propaganda cannot be taken away from us. Trans issues never were discussed publicly before, and this is the first time that people are talking about trans people. So what we have to do, I believe, is that whatever we have in our capacity, we need to use that to influence that discourse, because we don't have to get into the news. We are already there. So we just need to find allies who speak for us if we cannot, or we can speak ourselves, and we can shape this discourse. And I really believe that on the long run, they are just helping us. But obviously, there is a long way to go for that.
Absolutely. Alexa, do you have anything else to add?
No, nothing at present. I've just been analyzing everything that everybody else is saying. Although I do want to touch on what one colleague mentioned about the difficulties that can be faced in lobbying governments. And in my opinion, I find that is the most critical thing that we need to look at, because yes, we can do sensitization efforts on the ground amongst our communities in general society, but ultimately, if those who are in the seats of power, who have the means to control law and policy, if they have not been properly educated and sensitized, if they're not aware of the actual impact had on any laws that they may pass, amend, repeal, or otherwise interact with, if they don't have that proper understanding, every single letter of every single law or policy that they draft, read, debate, and pass can have a negative impact on us. And, you know, if within our own circles, we can pool resources and build capacity to be able to, even if it is write a letter to one senator, write a letter to one MP, write a letter to one congressman, you know, or an email or something, to be able to get our foot in the door to say, look, we need to be accounted for on the Senate floor or the House of Assembly floor or Congress floor or whatever hall of administration there is, whatever hall of legislature there is that controls the laws in our various territories and governments. Once we can get that down pat, it helps to wet the road a little bit that we can all slide along easily. That's something I think we should draw some attention to, because while we're looking at what's going on in our general population, we also need to consider that those who sit in the positions of power are also a reflection of our societies. So it's a two-way turbine. It can be that society can influence our parliament, or parliament can influence us. And whatever it is that we're doing, you know, as human rights defenders, as advocates, even as ordinary people, we need to be aware of the fact that whatever, you know, stance our government may have on one issue or another, whether it's personal or otherwise, it should not, as I always say, it should not tangle up our lives in it. You know, if you have a problem with, you know, transgender people, if it is that you don't, quote unquote, agree with how we exist or how we live, that is a personal problem that you need to deal with in your own time, and don't tangle up my life in it. That's what I always say. Because as it is on the ground interacting with each other, and when I say each other, not just trans people interacting with other trans people, but LGBTQ people on a whole, especially transgender people interacting and navigating general society. We have enough problems as it is when it comes to transphobia, when it comes to discrimination, when it comes to stigma. And the last thing that we need is for a government that, you know, will demand, for whatever reason, whether it is that we pay our taxes, whether it is that we, you know, make ourselves available when there's a call for emergency, you know, whatever it is that our governments may demand of us as citizens, you know, it really creates an unfair situation, a very disadvantageous situation, if that government is also going to join in with the stigmatizing and the discrimination, and yet still expect us to put our best foot forward or to avail, you know, make ourselves available in times of need. It's literally like poisoning the doctor and still expecting them to, you know, nurse your broken ankle.
Okay, thank you so much, Alexis. In closing, we only have a few minutes left. You know, we've had such a deep, rich discussion, and yes, we have gains, but we still have such a long way to go. And I would just like to give a word of caution. We've made huge gains. Yes, we've made huge gains in Argentina. We've made huge gains around the world, in Malta, in South Africa. You know, there's just been so much that has so much positive feedback that we've been receiving, and such positive steps we've been making. But then we hear the transgressions that are still happening. We hear of all the problems we're having in Hungary, for example, the issues that are happening in other third world countries, in Southern Africa, where I come from, what's happening in Haiti, what's happening in Afghanistan, in Asia. It really is so heartbreaking. So a word of advice is that we shouldn't rest on our laurels. We shouldn't sit back and say, yes, we're winning gains. Yes, we're doing good. Yeah, hip, hip, hooray. We really need to be on our guard, because the anti-gay movement, the anti-trans movement and anti-gay movement is really fighting against us. They're trying to roll back the gains that we have made. We're seeing it in anti-trans rhetoric, even in literature, in publications by J.K. Rowling's for one. She is very anti-trans at the moment. She has a huge following, and those people are all backed by even huger funding mechanism to spit out these words of vitriol and spit out this hatred, to try and overturn and undo all the great work that we're doing. So in closing, I would just like to ask us all to be vigilant and to stand together, because in unity we can win. Divided we stand, and united, divided we fall, and united we stand. So we just need to be very well aware of that and keep that in the back of our minds. And power to all of you and power to the rest of our movement. Thank you for tuning in and hope to see you in the next session, which is starting in 10 minutes time. Thank you very much.